how we can use climate storytelling.
Cool. Thank you, Skylar. And thank you all for being here and for being rad eco global citizens and ambassadors. I want to talk a little bit about what it is I do and a little bit about how what I do can give us insight into storytelling or telling your climate story. And I want to leave ample time for questions and discussion afterward too. So I'll move fairly quickly, but not so quickly that I start rambling, I hope. And I believe I can control the screen. I can, yes. So my name is Nick Kleese. I use he, him pronouns. And like Skylar said, I am currently a lecturer in first year writing at the University of Minnesota, but I am also the director of outreach at the Center for Climate Literacy here. Prior to coming to Minnesota, I was a high school English teacher, also a nature immersion educator with kindergartners, and I was a farm kid. So I'm the first in my family to go to college and graduate from college. Prior to me, my family farmed pigs and corn pretty much. And I come from Washington County, which is highlighted in red here on the screen. And we are known for being the third leading pork producing county in the nation. So there's about 20,000 human beings in the county, over 1.5 million pigs, the majority of which are raised in CAFOs or confined animal feeding operations. So watching this boom of the pork industry over the past 20 years really got me into climate activism and climate literacy work because it's horrifying to me, and it's sad to see what destruction that has on the ecology of my home county and the humans and the non-human animals. So that's where I'm coming from. And I bring all of that to my work at the Center for Climate Literacy. We're a pretty new center at the University of Minnesota. Formally, we've been around for 1.5 years or so, but we've been doing this work informally a little longer than that. And we do a variety of things, but the through line of what we do is we try to provide K-12 teachers, in-service teachers, the resources they need to teach climate literacy in their classrooms, regardless of grade level and regardless of content area. So we believe climate literacy education should be happening in pre-K, should be happening in 3rd grade, 7th grade, high school, higher ed, informal education. It should be happening in math. It should be happening in science, in English language, in music and art, so that this conversation never really stops and it becomes really, the climate crisis becomes impossible to ignore any longer. And so specifically, some of the things that we do are we publish a scholarly journal that publishes not only the sort of standard scholarly articles and analyses, but also publishes teachers. So we publish lesson plans, teacher reflections, and we also publish student work too. So the covers for each of our journals are designed by students, which is really rad. We also have an editorial and advising board, which you see on the right-hand side and on the bottom middle. These are activists, educators in the community, artists, writers who give us insight on what we should be doing and how we should be doing it. We also have we also have a few different professional development opportunities for educators, one of which is a year-long teacher fellowship program. And we work with these folks over the course of a whole school year to develop lesson plans and other materials for their classroom. So the 5 folks you see in the upper middle are our current fellows, and they come from English language arts, math, Chinese immersion, and science. So they've been doing really rad work, and it's been a privilege to work with them. And for all the things that we do and all the work we're trying to do with educators, we're also trying to advance a definition of climate literacy that centers storytelling. So the sort of mainstream and historical definition of climate literacy is really climate science literacy. It's an understanding of the science behind climate and the climate crisis. So what happens when sea level temperatures rise? What happens when CO2 emissions rise? What are the effects of that? Those sorts of things go into being climate science literate. And that is important. And that is a part of the way that we understand climate literacy. But for us, we are trying to understand climate literacy in a more expansive way. So for us, a climate literate person is someone who knows the climate science, but is able to translate that science into values, attitudes, beliefs, and actions that can alleviate the climate crisis. And we believe the best way to do that is through telling stories. And right now, y'all know this, so I'm not saying anything that's new to you. The dominant stories that are being told about climate are either climate denial or climate despair. So by denial, that could be just like flat out denial that climate change is occurring, or it could be a soft form of denial where folks might like recognize that climate change is happening, but believe that we can take our time or that someone else will take care of it. So that's a denial of the urgency of the crisis. Another corresponding story to that is climate despair. And this story tells us that, yes, climate change is happening, but there's nothing we can do. We just kind of got to live things out until the climate collapses. And we see this a lot, especially in young adult fiction. So you think of all the dystopian novels and films and shows that you've seen or read. It's everywhere. And at the Center for Climate Literacy, we reject that story. We don't believe that's true. And we want to offer a more hopeful, more active, and more transformative story that gives us hope and gives us a pathway for moving forward. And this is the reason why stories are important, is that they give us this opportunity to imagine and reflect on what else our global civilization could look like. And so for us, that hope is not a passive disposition or capacity, but it's an active thing. Hope is a way of seeing alternatives and acting on them. And for that reason, one of my favorite climate texts is this book in translation by Shinsuke Yoshitake called There Must Be More Than That. And the story does exactly what the title says. The protagonist's brother comes in and says, oh, like the world's bad, it's getting worse, there's nothing we can do. And the protagonist says, as you can see on the slide, no, that's wrong, there's always alternatives. And it's fun to think about what's beyond good or bad or yes or no. There's always multiple things that we could do. And for this reason, I think and believe and know that stories that come from young people themselves are the most important stories that we can tell about the climate. And this is going to be way too brief, but I want to put out a few ideas there as y'all think about your story maps and your projects, is that as you think about what your project is and what your story map will be, I encourage you, if you are comfortable with it, to consider including your story to your very specific story. That doesn't need to be explicitly in regards to the climate crisis, but I think knowing that there's an individual human being who's creating the story and sharing the story makes it all the more powerful. And as you do that, think about what real possible ideas for alternative social structures you can offer. So, my pitch for education is that, or my alternative vision of education is that climate literacy is taught in every classroom. It's not just for science educators, but it's for everybody. That's the alternative that I put forward. So you can think about what your passion is and what you want folks to hone in on. As with any good story, you can think about plot. And this doesn't need to be super clear in your telling of it, but if you have in mind, at least a starting point, and that could be like, here is where we are in 2023, and here's where we want to be in 2030. That's enough of a plot to draw folks' attention in. And the fourth suggestion, the rule of three, I could teach a whole course on this, but for now, as you're thinking about what you want to include in your story, think about what can come in threes. So that could be 3 steps, maybe 3 images that repeat, 3 motifs that come back around, maybe a line or a phrase is repeated 3 times. There's a lot of power in just the number 3. And so even if you find just one thing to repeat 3 times, that in itself can be powerful. And if you think about some of the powerful stories that you heard as a young person, especially oral stories, if you're familiar with the 3 Little Pigs, rule of 3, it's just this thing that we know and we understand as human beings. And if you are thinking about perhaps going into education, and I'd be happy to talk more about this too in the Q&A, and I'll be done after this slide. So I'm going to welcome your questions and ideas, but in my mind, if you are considering education, it would be good if you enjoyed working with people. That doesn't mean that you need to be an extrovert. I'm an introvert. I love working with people, but it's very tiring for me. So at the end of the day, I need to take a nap before I can do anything else. But I really do enjoy working with folks and finding ways to have their ideas come to fruition. I think it's also important to balance idealism and optimism with the realities of the present. I work with pre-service teachers. And so these are folks who are getting their teaching license and they're getting ready to teach. And sometimes folks have this very romantic idea of what education is or what teaching is going to be like. And I think that can be good to hang on to, but the reality is much more complex than that. So if you can kind of balance those two, that'll get you pretty far. And no matter what you're interested in teaching, no matter where or who you're interested in teaching, I encourage you to think about how you can bring climate literacy or what y'all are learning this summer as part of this program into your classrooms. And so if this is something you are interested in doing, you can start thinking of opportunities to teach informally right now. So that doesn't necessarily need to be in a classroom. It could be teaching in a summer program. It could be tutoring. It could be coaching. Anything where you have sort of a mentorship role or a facilitation role can help give you practice at some of those foundational skills that teachers need. And as you do these things, and you collect these informal teaching experiences, hang on to those as potential models for what you might do in a K-12 classroom, if that's where you want to go. Some of the most important lessons I learned about teaching did not come in my teaching training, and it did not come while I was teaching in a classroom. It came from my experiences teaching informally in nature education, coaching sports. I learned a lot from those folks and those contexts. And I think they made me a better teacher in the classroom. So, I see a couple comments in the chat. Yes, teaching, you've no doubt heard and experienced some of the stresses happening now. In regards to education, it's sort of a fraught field, but at the heart, I love teaching. It brings me a lot of joy. And whether you want to teach or whatever you want to do, even working on your story maps, find the joy in that, I hope. And on that point, I'm looking forward to an enjoyable discussion. So I'll be done now. Take a drink of water. And yeah, let me know what questions or thoughts y'all have. Oh, I see one comment about just informal teaching about climate generally. Yes. And I'll underscore that point that um, education happens in the classroom, but if you think about how much time you spend outside of the classroom in your lives and how much you learn outside of the classroom, it's that might even be a more generative space than classroom teaching. So as ambassadors, like y'all will be teaching about climate, even in like one-on-one interactions you have with folks in the future. But because you are knowledgeable now and experienced now, you'll have insight to offer others. So yeah, you are teachers already. Let's see. Let's see. Do you have any tips on telling others climate stories with integrity and respectfulness? Oh, that's such a good question. Yes, I think one important thing to do with that is to consider if someone has already told that story, if the community is already working on storytelling, and if there are already stories that exist from that community, then that can be a place to start and pause and listen and learn from those stories. And always reaching out to folks too, and seeing how you can plug in. I also think it's important to recognize positionalities too. So I am a white man from the Midwest, and I tell my own story from that perspective too. When I talk about the experiences of other communities, I am mindful of that positionality and try to find certainly differences in experience that have to do with identity, but also geography, but also similarities too. And I think, keeping in mind to connections and collaborations and community building, even across difference, can go a long way. So that's not a short answer to your question, Senna, but it's sort of a way of approaching the idea of sharing others' stories. Yeah, cross-cultural storytelling. And Robert asks a similar question, cross-cultural storytelling, giving linguistic and pedagogical differences. Oh, yeah, another really good question. And I think, maybe I'll extend what I was saying about Senna's question. And in that work, some of it's going to depend on the very specific project that you're doing. But as a first step and a rule of thumb, I find it very useful and important to, one, try to find a way to connect with that community first, before you begin working on that. So that could be, a community elder, a scholar in that community, a community leader, just somebody in that community that you could reach out to and begin talking with, to see what you might have to share, what you might need to learn, those sorts of things. Lots of really good questions. I want to ask y'all for your thoughts on these. Lara asks, what would be the best way to educate vulnerable communities about the climate crisis? Good question. And I think about that in relationship to my home community too, which is majority white, but working class, generally undereducated in the formal sense. So not a lot of folks go to college. And at the same time, folks in my home community are living the climate crisis. Like they're living in an area that has water pollution, air pollution, soil degradation. And so they have these embodied experiences that can teach me a lot, because now I'm not living in that community anymore. And at the same time, I have something to share too, because I have the privilege of having time and space to do reading, have wonderful conversations like this. And so we can talk across different ways of understanding the crisis. For me right now, it's more intellectual. For folks in my home community, it's more experiential and lived. And so, Laura, to your question, the best way to educate vulnerable communities about the crisis would be maybe to think about what you can share, like what they can teach you, what you can teach them. And I think there are just a couple other questions, and I want to make sure that I leave time for the other presentation too. So Skylar and folks, holler at me if or when I need to stop. But Tim asks earlier, when you try to implement climate literacy into a curriculum, do you see resistance from institutions or policymakers? If so, what kind? I'm fortunate being in Minnesota where folks are pretty receptive to teaching about climate. The resistance that we have that I see most common isn't necessarily like a militant resistance where like you can't do that, but it's more so like, you know, we don't have the place in the curriculum, there's not enough time, there's not enough funding to provide training for folks, even if people are receptive to it. So that's that sort of like soft denial that I see. In my home state of Iowa, folks might be more militantly resistant to the idea of teaching about climate as something that's like politically sensitive. And when those situations arise, sometimes it's just a matter of changing the vocabulary. So rather than calling it climate or nature, we can call it the outdoors, because people don't see themselves necessarily as an environmentalist, but they might see themselves as an outdoor person. These have different connotations, but essentially they mean the same thing, right? So finding ways to work through some of the negative connotations folks might have with climate literacy, and finding shared values and shared commitments is step number one. And then the last question I see is, what kind of elements do we need in stories and to make sure that they're heard? I said this earlier, but I'll say it again too, that I think having specific characters, and for me, I like speaking first from the first person because it helps ground myself. But if you can think of a very specific voice, whether it's you or a non-human animal or a plant or another human, to kind of help your readers and listeners come into the story. Humans have an easier time understanding stories if they have a character to identify with. And that's part of the challenge of talking about climate, the climate crisis, is because it's so big and abstract that it can begin to become hard to focus on particulars. But if you can find a particular voice, to bring folks in to identify with, that's another way to get folks on board. That's part of the reason why Greta Thunberg became sort of the face and the voice of the youth climate protest, is because the protests needed someone as representative, and that happened to be Greta. So yes. Wow, I said this earlier, but I'd really love, I know this isn't possible, but I wish we could have this conversation go on for a long time. And I'm really curious to see what y'all come up with for your projects. And I am always happy to answer questions too. My email is right there, so you can reach out to me at any time. We, again, at the Center for Climate Literacy, do publish student work. We publish youth work, and we want more of that. Adults have had the primary say in the climate crisis for a long time. I think I'm motivated to stop paying lip service to that and to actually include youth voice. So if you want to plug in, just give me a holler. But Skylar and folks, is there anything else y'all would like from me before we transition?
No, I think that was an excellent discussion and so informative. And thank you to everyone who asked questions. They were so engaging. And just a reminder to all of our eco ambassadors and students, there's an activity this week for you to practice your own climate storytelling, if that's something you'd like to submit to Nick in the journal. And I think it's really great practice for you thinking towards the future of your story map to get work with the storytelling and specifically telling your own